was within the Sunset Lake properties. If you want to follow the roads, this is Washington Valley Road going down here. Plaquemine is up here, Martinsville is down here. The mountain area is over here. The lodge area is here. This is Miners Road here. This is Coryell. And every map that you see kind of from now on comes right as a derivative of this particular one. So we'll now go back in time to see how things looked 100 years ago. The closest we can come is a 1931 aerial. This is showing the Hoffman Farm. It may be kind of tough to see, but this area here is grayed out, just ever so slightly. This is what, that looks good. This is what Doc Miners and Alice Miners purchased in 1921, which is why several people who had the signs basically said, okay, Sunset Lake started in 1921. But if you take a look at this, it's not all of it. This lake here did not exist in 1921. And you can see all the fields here. These are farm fields. You can see the heavily wooded area up here, but this is all farm. And we'll get into how everything was owned. This is the next section of Sunset Lake. It's called the Walcott Tract. You know, it's a little bit in yellow here. When this was purchased, and it was eventually acquired in 1927, we'll get a little more detail about how that occurred. There was nothing there. There were no roads. There was no lake. It was for the most part just woods, unimproved, and nobody had ever lived there. The third part of the acquisition comes a little bit later. This is the Cube Track. It's a small little track that's just off of here. It's got a little bit of frontage on Washington Valley Road, but other than that, it really is not connected. Now we're going to go meet the people who were responsible for doing all of this. Okay, the Hoffmans owned a farm. They moved here from Lebanon, New Jersey in about 1840. They occupied the large White House that was at the base of today Miners and North Shore. Joseph Henry Hoffman, he lived in the lodge, and he had a son, Eli, who was born in Lebanon, New Jersey, but spent virtually his entire life in that house, and they farmed it. And he married Anna. And Eli passed away in 1904, leaving his property to Anna and the kids. Well, they soon grew tired of farming, and they met a guy by the name of George Lamont. So anyone around here from Bound Brook should have heard that name. He gave the Bound Brook Library, the land for the Washington Campground, the initial 70-odd acres for Northover Camp Cromwell. He was a very big politician and a land speculator. Well, he purchased this land from the Hoffmans in 1917, and the Hoffmans held the mortgage. So George would pay him for a few years until the Miners came along in 1921, purchased the land from George Lamont. He made a small profit, but he did something that was really important. The mortgage continued to be held by the Hoffman family. So here are all the information, the deeds, and the Hoffmans remained in the area, and they're interred in the Plaquemine Cemetery. Now we're going to meet the Walcotts. Now the land known as the Walcott Tract, was purchased in 1873 by Clara and Charles Child's parents. They passed away in the mid-1880s, didn't leave much of an estate. They lived out in Roselle. They've held this land for like 10 years, but unclear that they ever even visited. Well, since there wasn't much of an estate, that land went into receivership. There was a sheriff's sale, and Clara and Charles purchased it for the sum of $500. And that was that whole big chunk of yellow area that you saw previously. Well, Clara married Henry Walcott, and they lived in Montclair, New Jersey. So that's where the name Walcott comes from. It's also the same town that Doc Miner's father had his jewelry business in it. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is where 1924 comes in, is Henry is dying of liver cancer. And for the sake of his health, they decided that they should move to Arizona. At that point, there had been no talks of anything, no recorded deals of basically any sort. But since they were leaving in 1924, they appeared to have some sort of handshake deal with Doc Miners. And with that, Doc Miners went ahead, effectively combining the properties and started his plan. So here's the idea of Sunset Lake. He now has the two large properties which can constitute the entire part of Sunset Lake. The land was sold to Doc Miners for a few $1,000, and they withheld about 4 lots. Bonnie Diggeris's house today was on one of those lots. Henry passes away in 1926. There's still no ownership change. The family still owned it, but in January of the next year, they signed the property over to Doc Miners and he could officially start. Now we're going to meet the Miners family. The person on the left is Doc Miners. This is a film clip from 1937. His wife, Alice Siegel Miners, is there. And he was a very interesting person. He graduated from NYU as a veterinarian. He lived in the sort of New York area working as a veterinary surgeon, lived in Summit, started his own cross-country business tour program in 1911 where he sold 1,500 shares of stock in it. He lived in Boonton, New Jersey during World War I and helped prepare horses for the war. He then mysteriously goes off and becomes a yard supervisor in Detroit for 1 year in 1920. Guess that didn't work out so well because he came back in 21 and purchased the Hoffman Farm. They lived there in the lodge for a number of years. He founded what's called the Miners Demarest Realty Company in 1927, and he is 49 years old. So, he's well up there. He's a jack of all trades. He's the secretary of his dad's jewelry business in Montclair in the 1930s. He's a traffic manager in New York City in the 40s. He worked in Camp Kilmore with horses during World War II, and he lived out in California next to his brother in 1950. He's pretty much, kind of all over the place. He's very good with people. He's very good at talking other things. So now we're going to hear a couple of comments about him. The auto is not showing up here.
It's very low. It's playing.
Oh yeah, we met him. He walked us through the properties. He showed us the properties. Mm-hmm. We saw him first. I guess we saw him on 2 different occasions. The first time might have been when we came up here by ourselves. He might have been walking or something. Had like a short conversation with him, but then actually met him to walk properties on the 4th of July. So I met him twice. And I remember him as being a very nice old man. Never did meet Mrs. Miners.
Had you met Dr. Miners at all?
Oh, yeah, we met him. He walked us through the properties. He showed us the properties. We saw him first, I guess we saw him on two different occasions. The first time might have been when we came up here by ourselves. He might have been walking or something, had like a short conversation with him, but then actually met him to walk properties on the 4th of July. So I met him twice. And I remember him as being a very nice old man. Never did meet Mrs. Beiners.
Had you met Dr. Miners? Had you met Dr. Miners at all?
Oh, yeah, we met him. He walked us through the properties. He showed us the properties. We saw him first, I guess we saw him on two different occasions. The first time might have been when we came up here by ourselves. He might have been
agreed
walking.
to 3,000 even because of the mix-up instead of 3,300. And he said me send my lawyer in Newark, Benjamin Feinfeld, $50 every month until you pay it off.
Okay, so was there interest charges or no?
No
interest?
charge.
No charges, and you
No.
just keep paying until it's done.
Yeah, and I think we paid maybe 6 or 8 months or less, and then I had some more money and we paid it off. Dr. Miners agreed to 3,000. Dr. Miners
Dr.
agreed
Miners said,
to
"What about this
3,000
one?" And we
even
walked up.
because of
It was
the
steep, and we got up there. Marcy and I just thought, okay, we'll do it. And then Dr. Miner said, it's a handshake. And Marcy said, well, a little bit more than the handshake. And I think Marcy had something like $20 in his wallet, 1958. Dr. Miners accepted the $20, took a handshake. He said, okay, my lawyer will be getting in touch with you. That was the 4th of July, and we did get the paperwork from the attorney. And we were making, Dr. Miner said to us, you will pay me what you can, when you can, no interest. Come January, this is 1958, come January 1959, we get a certified letter from the attorney saying that Dr. Miners had passed away in Arizona.
Yes.
But the deal was the deal. You continue to pay what you can, when you can, no interest. And at that point, Marcy said, I want it to be mine, so we paid for the lot. All of $2,600.
Dr. Miners agreed to 3,000 even because of the mix-up
Dr. Miners
instead
said,
of
what about this
3,300.
Okay. It'll continue on. Okay. This is a topo map. And you can see the outline of what is Sunset Lake in here and the various parcels in here. When the lines are very, very far apart, it means things are relatively flat. When they're close together, it means it's extremely steep. So you can see where the Sunset Lake is, it's very wide. It's not very, it's fairly shallow. Now, realize that this is 1927. There's not a lot in the way of earth-moving equipment around. So the first thing we're going to see are roads. And they're filling that in right now, followed by a dam, followed by Sunset Lake. Now, one has to realize exactly what it took to do this. Again, there's no great earth-moving equipment at the time. There's kind of steam shovels. You've got a big mountain coming down. Chambershoek is running right at the edge of that mountain there. There are no roads. So he has to take the dirt that's in this little valley here and create a road. Same time, he has to build roads up into the mountains, creating, evergreen and Walcott and rosemary and Arnold and magnolia, birch and hickory. He also is creating the roads on the valley side of the lake, such as Coryell and Lakeview and Sunset. The area here at this end where the spillway is about 20 feet deeper than the shallow end. So he has to build a dam that's over 20 feet in height from the valley floor. And it's approximately 550 feet long. And he's doing this entire thing on his own nickel. So it takes, we think, approximately 2 years to build this. So he's moved a tremendous amount of dirt, and you've seen the dredging in some of the pictures, just how long that takes. And the roads that he did carve were effectively one-lane dirt roads. He did his best to preserve the trees, went around them, so they're not exactly straight, but pretty good for the time. This is the same map overlaid with the 1927 lot map. So sometime in 1926, his dream is becoming reality. He is paid for this. There are now roads here. He has hired a surveyor. They have carved up all of Sunset Lake into quarter-acre lots. The big area, whoa. That's a good rescue. Okay, this big area right here is where the lodge and the stables are. You can see in 1927 there is no spillway here because it's early. It hasn't been built yet. It hasn't been designed. The area up in here has been carved out, and notice that a lot of streets here, they're never built, but some of these streets remain on Bridgewater maps today. So now it's starting in earnest. It's 1928. The valve to the lake has been closed in February. The lake is filling up, and it's time to start selling. He forms the Miners Demarest Realty Company, where Demarest is sort of his financial support from New York City. He's really good at advertising, so there are a large number of ads in all sorts of newspapers telling you about the virtues of Sunset Lake, what it's going to be. It's this whole summer colony. This is designed as a resort community. It's designed for single season homes that are open from April to October and then shut down. There are caretakers, there is horseback riding, there is going to be swimming, canoeing, boating, sledding, whatever you want, Doc Miners was willing to provide. Now he already started out with the lodge, he already had the stables, so they're starting to populate those. The area near Lakeview, that's kind of behind, only continued to Catalpa. Everything to the east of that became sort of open area, and it was relatively flat. Now what you're going to see is how the homes were built and in what order and by decade. So there's a little graph at the bottom here. It's going to show you cumulatively the number of homes. And this is by year, so we're starting about 1920. We're going to end up here, but most of it ends up by about 1970. The first homes you're going to see are from the 20s, and they're going to be kind of red in color. And you're going to get to see where these were built. And then you're going to sit by looking at this graph and seeing when it's steep, it says times are good. When it's flat, times are not so good. And remember, when you started this, it's 1928. And we're basically starting to walk into the Depression. And then we're going to walk into World War II, and you're going to see all the effects of that. So first coming these are the homes sold in the 1920s. Most of them are in the flat area here, and a lot of them are in the Walcott tract. They are not in the original Hoffman part. The yellows are the 1930s, blues are the 1940s, orange are the 1950s, and the greens are the 1960s. So you can see how it populated. The areas that were most popular were kind of in this area. And you saw a lot of it up here, but there's still a lot of open land and stuff here. And those homes were all built much later. And we'll go into why. Now, if you look at this graph, and granted it's a little hard to see, you get a pretty good start. So there are a lot of homes sold very, very quickly. And into the, but you're walking into the Depression, so 1930s, growth is really, really slow. You hit the 1940s and World War II, it's almost non-existent. And the economy does not recover quickly after World War II. So until 1955 or so, they don't really sell a whole heck of a lot of houses. And then it starts to take off, and Sunset Lake starts to become what it was, but not what it was intended to be. Now, Doc Miners was very much into rules and regulations, but not all that many. So here were 11 conditions that they're called deed restrictions. They're written into every deed in there. And the most important one was that every house located on the lake, and these are all the properties right on the lake, they had to sell for a minimum of $3,000. Well, back then, that's a lot of money. So what did people do? They bought one street up. And because there were no trees, this was all farmland, if you owned a home on Lakeview, you had a lakeside view. If you bought homes on the mountainside and the low ones on like Arnold and parts of Evergreen, you had a lake view. So this was great. Remember, he purchased the bulk of the entire estate for probably about $12,000 or $15,000. Now, any lot that was not on the lake was fully negotiable. Now, this also told you a little bit about what you get when you sign up for a lot. You get water, but you don't get a septic tank. You can build a house, but you can't have a flat roof, can't have a garage, you can't make noise. It's kind of your version of a homeowners association. They're just a whole bunch of rules, but you had to check with him to ensure that your house was okay. And to give you an idea, prefab homes at the time, cabins, went for about $500. So relatively inexpensive. Now we're going to look at some of the cabins. Now this is a model, and this model home, we believe, was probably somewhere off of Miners Road. It's where he ran the office. This house right here belonged to Marshall Smith, who is at this point about 95 years old. He was one of the people who lived at the lake very early. It's at the base of Evergreen. It's no longer standing, and he'll talk about that. And this was Chip Mills' house on Evergreen, and this is the inside. Now, one thing that you see about the cabins here was they had a very iconic sort of chimney. It was stone, and this one had a little figurine in it. And this is the inside. They had Dutch doors, they had porches, but they were pretty bare bones. Typically, 700 square foot was considered a large house. This house at the time was considered the party house at the lake and was one of the biggest.
There was no bathroom inside the house?
At the Sunset Lake?
Yes.
Oh, there's a bathroom in there.
Oh.
But the pipes are all on the ground, top of the ground, feeding the water into the house. So it was only during the summers that you had running water in the house, including the toilet.
So in the wintertime, when you went, did you go with your dad, you said in the fall? Right?
Yeah, right, in the winter.
Yes, so then you had to go to the bathroom outside?
No, well, yes and no. We just went out in the woods because
Well, that's what I mean.
it was all male, and you just went out in the woods to pee and have a bowel movement because
Wow.
that's all there was. There wasn't any other alternative.
Cabin, the one we had was small. It had a
This is
full-length
Marshall
porch,
Smith talking
screened-in
about this
porch
house.
on the front. Inside was was a living room, and I don't remember what we had in the line of bedrooms. I know we must have had them somewhere, but there was a little tiny kitchen and a small toilet area, and that was about it. Royal Lives, yeah. He was a friend of my father's, and he bought it from us, and then we bought it, then I bought it back from him. And it's interesting that my father charged him exactly what it had cost him to build the house, and he charged me exactly what he had paid my father. So nobody made any money on the transitions.
And that was over about 30 years. So that cabin sold for, I don't know, $1,000 or so in 1960. Now, this looks like a pretty impressive list of property ownership. at Sunset Lake in 1930. What was important was you had to own property, but you didn't necessarily have to build a house on it. So most of these people here had no homes at the time. Again, it's pretty early on. And he had two brothers and a sister. Arnold, as in also Arnold Drive, that's up on the mountain, and Gustav, and Carrie Miner's Rabe, sister. They accounted for about 12 of the original 20 or so lots sold in 1928. So he had a great support system. The thing looking at this list, and everyone's heard that, well, people were coming from New York City and stuff, and you look to this list and, well, they're from Newark and Plainfield and Montclair and Somerville and Raritan and Jersey City. Almost everybody that lived at Sunset Lake and visited were all locals. It took a while. Starting is never an easy thing, especially when you're kind of doing it on your own nickel. But the valve was closed on the dam in 1928. Things didn't quite work out between Dock Miners and the state of New Jersey, so they had to hire an engineer from Trenton who rebuilt the entire dam in late 1929. So it's really opening up for business in about 1930. So this is the official photograph that was in the Courier News in July of 1929. The building in here is the lodge. This is the home at the base of Miners and North Shore. There was a wraparound porch in that, and there are all these people. It was quite the celebration, and things were taking off pretty nicely. Now, to run a place requires a lot of help. So Dock Miners had the lodge, but he also had a little caretaker cottage there. So we hired George Plummer, and his wife Gertrude joined him. They created all these signs. Gertrude would design them. George would cut them out with his jigsaw. And he had to do everything. He opened up your cabin for you, which means he took the kerosene out of the toilet, got the water system running, made sure everything was all clean. It was kind of a whole service deal. He also ran the stables, kept all those clean. He also, with several lake residents, went around with a horse and a cart and picked up all the garbage after parties. They paid him pretty well. But as you approach World War II, what happened? Well, all the help was going to war, and George was going with them. So the next part is going to show you what life is like in the 1930s. There's a series of videos. These were all taken in 1937, and it shows life at the lake. In some ways, it's not a lot different than it is today, and in some ways, it's very different.
We'd sometimes ride to Puckaman on our horses. There wasn't that much traffic on Mountain Valley Road. And of course, we'd take the horses for shoeing at the blacksmith there. As between the store and the church, I believe the blacksmith was.
The woman in here is Dock Miner's niece.
Were all wool, and they never dried out from day to day, of course.
Oh,
So
boy.
when you went swimming every day, you put on a clammy, cold wool bathing suit,
Right.
whether it was boys or girls, didn't matter.
And then I do remember that one time, I don't know how it came about, but we got a hold of a water slide. And we put that on the beach for everybody to use. And almost immediately thereafter, we had to take it down because everybody was sliding on it, and it was wearing out the bathing suits. So everybody was going home with holes in their bathing suits.
He was responsible for the teaching Dave how to sail, not only to paddle a canoe, but to sail a sailing canoe. It wasn't quite enough space, but enough to learn how to sail. And he taught, I had a rowboat with a little half-quarter power motor, which we
She is 6.5 to
used
7 years old.
on the river, but not at the Sunset Lake, but in the fall and spring. I could take my little boat, rowboat actually, and then put on this little quarter horse motor and go puttering along the river. Of course, now you wouldn't let a young girl do that by themselves, which is too bad.
Oh, yeah, so we were the only ones generally that went up there. We had the ice skating on the lake, and then we would exercise Duke, and he would pull us on skis with a rope by horse around the barn there.
Okay.
And through the snow.
Horse?
And that, what?
It's a horse?
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. And that was fun.
Okay, by the late 30s, the Depression is really taking its toll. The various, entertainment group here at the Sunset Lake Club was doing okay. They held enough membership. Dues was 10 to 15 bucks. But Doc Miners was a little bit of a different story. So he had been renting out the lodge at 50 bucks a month to the Sunset Lake Club. But he now decided he needed a little bit more, and he was kind of always a horse person. So we looked at creating the Sunset Lake Guest Lodge, and he hired a Bronco buster who was actually working down near where Fresh Market is in the old Kenilworth Inn stables. And he would come up here and he would give riding lessons. The lodge rooms could be rented out. The venture was highly advertised. In other words, he's starting to let outsiders coming in. He needs another funding stream to try to keep things going. So pamphlets and stuff were going out. And then sort of disaster hit. During the Depression, cash was in very short supply. It became very much a barter economy. And Doc Miners was solving his financial woes by effectively giving people lots, typically north of Washington Valley Road, to settle their debts. And this worked fine for a very, very long time. But I told you earlier that the Hoffmans held the mortgage on the property. And this became a little bit of a problem because Anna Hoffman passes away in 1940. And her children decide that they've had enough. Doc Miners has been in the arrears for a long time on the mortgage. He hadn't made payments in a long, long time. And barter economy wasn't going to work because they didn't want their old land back and only getting a handful of lots instead of the whole thing. So they forced a sheriff's sale. And this is where 5 of the residents of Sunset Lake, and they were all lawyers and engineers and doctors, banded together and they formed what was called Sunset Lake Estates. And they purchased 52 acres of land that Doc Miners had sort of cut out. And this included the lodge, everything east of what is today Miners, south of Washington Valley Road, and north of Chambersbrook. And that would be the land that would be sold. They were the only bidders, and he got $8,100 for it. So this satisfied everything else. So the newspapers report this as the 5 residents are basically bailing Doc Miners out. He should be very grateful about the whole thing. These are pictures of the people who lived around here. The lodge is now going to become a community center because it's owned by other individuals. Other than the caretaker's house and the stables, there were no other properties on there. Some of the film footage you saw where the horses riding, everything over there was just grassland. So it seemed like a pretty good deal, but Doc Miners had the kind of luck that just never quite got him through because Pearl Harbor at this point was not very far away. The war years were very serious business for Sunset Lake. Things were tough. You had gas rationing, food rationing. Produce was big here because you had the farms just down the street, so you could get fresh produce. But it was also a resort community, so technically you were not allowed to drive here. So by 1945 or so, there were almost no residents left. The caretakers and all the help had all enlisted in the military. They were gone. There was nobody to repair anything. The lodge was also, in 1944, used as a convalescent home for British and Scottish sailors whose ships had been torpedoed by German U-boats. So we'll hear a little bit.
Did you have any trouble getting gas to get to the lake?
We didn't because my father was a doctor. And he said it was interesting that when he first started out, at the beginning of the war, he could get all the gas he wanted. He just had a card, he would go into the gas station and fill it up. But then they decided that he would have to have a gas card like everybody else, and he could have all he wanted, but he had to present the card, supposedly limit his gas. And he said the interesting thing was, when he could have all he wanted without having to give them anything, he really restricted his gas use because of the war. When he got the cards that he had to give in each time, his gas use went up. We had a bunch of, I think they were British soldiers that had been wounded and came there to recuperate.
Yeah, during, I think they lived in the lodge area.
Yeah, they did. They came down to the beach and talked with us down there. And the one thing I remember is that at that time I was collecting butterflies, and one of the guys told me that he had, actually it was a moth that he had caught and did I want it? And I said, sure. And so he had caught, it was a Luna moth that he had put in a cage. It was still alive. And so it was, by the time I got it, it was pretty beat up from trying to get out of the cage. But it was actually the only Luna moth I had in my collection.
Bridge, the iron bridge going across the lake to the other side where our cabin was, collapsed. But they couldn't get metal or steel to rebuild the bridge.
At this point, there are very few residents. Many of the homes were abandoned. They couldn't take care of them. People were selling them for anything that they could get. One of the only bright side was they all got blackout shutters, so that was one of the few positive things that came out of it. But the sun is basically setting on this type of lifestyle. Things were changing. One of the sailors used to walk around the lake playing the bagpipes. But every new beginning comes from some other's beginning end. And we march on because there's no other alternative. Sunset Lake, well, 1946, Sunset Lake creates the Mountain Development Corporation. Doc Miners has found some financial people in New York City, and he effectively assigns the bulk of Sunset Lake to that corporation, but remains an officer. The 5 residents who owned the 52 acres sell their land to Charles Tice because he had cash. They were going to make a little bit of money. Everybody was tired of everything at that point. So the 52 acres were sold. Now those people and then Mr. Tice, who purchased all that land, then subsequently subdivided it. And Doc Miners was so incensed about really losing control of that he forbid them any access to Sunset Lake. They couldn't even use the name Sunset Lake. But some of those residents were pretty smart, they're pretty sharp. They realized that there were a lot of unsold lots up in the mountains full of rocks that nobody wanted. So they could buy those lots for $100 or so, and then they would get full swim rights. They advertised quite heavily. So they had a big auction. This was in 1947. They're doing everything they can to sell more lots, but the economy after World War II is not particularly good. So with all the hoopla, all the advertising, bringing big name auctioneers in there, they managed to sell all of 2 lots. This is the lodge, or the clubhouse. This is an original picture from the 1930s. It's looked very different over the years. Several people remember when it had, this is the 1960s or so, it had some beautiful columns and yellow shutters. And this is the current owners sort of repainted it, but they stripped out everything here, and they found out that the place had used rocks for insulation. The clubhouse rented out for $50 a month in the 1930s. The bill for cleaning the place was about $3. And if you walk by the area, by the road, you'll see this sort of green algae here and a fence around it, and you look and you see a little bit of concrete. There used to be a roof over that, and that was the water source for anyone who wanted it, and there was be a ladle sitting there. We could talk a little bit about life in the 50s. And this audio is by Chris Lant, who was a resident.
We moved there in 1951. It was very forested with many animal species. And my grandmother wouldn't visit because she felt like eyes were watching her from the woods. Lakeview Drive stopped at our driveway. And our driveway was the corner of Lakeview and Catalpa. And Lakeview Drive did not go any further east. So all there was were woods and dirt roads. Catalpa was a dirt road, Coryell was a dirt road, all dirt roads. The lake at that time was full of turtles, fish, frogs, snakes, and leeches. And there were many cattails. And it was quite muddy. The float was high up on barrels. There were 2 diving boards and there was a sliding board because insurance companies didn't tell you couldn't back then. There were mostly small cottages and log cabins.
a few bigger houses like ours. Ours was considered one of the biggest. But they didn't have, like a lot of modern conveniences, they didn't have central heat and they didn't have air conditioning. So that's what the neighborhood was like. We swam in the lake, no lifeguard yet. And when you got out of the water, you had to brush off all the leeches because it was such a pond in the middle of the woods. And so you had to brush off all these leeches when you got out of the water. And then as we grew older, we had sailing lessons with Mr. Knapp. And he taught us, we sailed little sunfish. And the first thing he taught us was like to capsize, what to do. So we capsized like a million times, learning what to do. We had a haunted house in the neighborhood. It was halfway along Lakeview, had belonged to people named the Algairs. For a while they were there and we all played there. Then later on, it became like a haunted house. They left it and nobody moved in, and it was just haunted looking, and people saw ghosts there. And it was the house halfway along Lakeview with a ramp, and it was like a haunted house. So we snuck in the windows. We all used to sneak in the windows and look for wills and hidden treasure. And of course, we never found any, but we were hopeful. We always climbed in those windows and looking for that will and the hidden treasure.
At this point, there are only 2 entrances to Sunset Lake, so it's a very secluded community. You can see advertising signs here. This is Hoffman Drive, which later is named Miners, and this is at Coryell. These are the Alice Miners years in the late 50s and the 60s. After Doc Miners passed away in Arizona in 1959, Alice has been living in Montclair and kind of following Doc around all over the place, decides to move back to Sunset Lake and builds a house near the top of Catalpa. Now, an interesting thing is Doc was always making these handshake deals or, give me $1 and you got the lot, and they were always honored. But he passed away and some of the paperwork wasn't done, but he honored all commitments. He made them good. So the lake at this point, you're in the 50s. Not a lot of money's been spent. It's in horrible shape. Money's needed. They need to do a lot of work. It needs to be spruced up. So there was a whole round of bond solicitation. Bylaws were created. They had to establish ownership. So quitclaim deeds were in there. They built a brand new beach house, replacing the one that had, pretty much rotted away here. And by mid-50s, lots were selling pretty well. Alice, you just go up to Alice Miners and say you want a lot, and for a good price, you could have it. And now we're starting to see a tremendous amount of development around Bridgewater. Sunset Lake Estates, Shadow Oak Estates is coming in. Washington Valley Development is coming in. Sewers are coming in. So all of a sudden, there are a lot more entrances. Do you have a power line? The battery is running low on the laptop. Okay.
I want to say it was 1963 or 1964 they drained the lake for the first time ever since they had built it. And they attempted to excavate all the mud and dirt and what have you out of the lake. And they hired a guy in Somerville, John Seibert. He had a small, I don't want to call it construction company, but let's just call it a contracting company. You know how big like the regular sized huge earth movers are? He had 3 baby earth movers, an old D6 Caterpillar tractor and something else, and he said, I'll just go and scoop it out and dump it on the other side, blah, 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 blah. So they drained the lake out, and he started operations, and within no time at all, his earth movers in the contracting world, they call them pans. All his pans in broad daylight got stuck in the road, not because it was muddy or anything like that, but the road couldn't bear the weight of these things, and the road just collapsed underneath him. But what they didn't realize, the reason why it was collapsing is because the freshly put in pipes for the sewer treatment assembly got crushed. Nobody realized that at the time until we had a heavy rainstorm one day. All the manhole covers all blew off. and there was raw sewage dumping into the lake. You could smell it for miles. It was horrible. Tissue everywhere. There was effluent everywhere. And this became a yearly event for years because John's company probably, I want to say at least 6, 7, 8 times became almost bankrupt because of his job. It just, everything that this guy ever tried, it didn't work out for him. I mean, he left his, every day when 3:30, 4 o'clock, and the guys would get done, wherever the equipment was, that's where it stayed. So right in the deepest part of the lake, one day there were a couple of earth movers and something else. We had a huge thunderstorm one day. I mean, they must have dumped 8, 9, 10 inches of rain. Massive thing. The lake filled up just like that. The valve that was only about this big to let the water out couldn't handle this massive rush of water coming in. And Dad wakes me up next morning, come on, quick, come on. Runs out the door, we got the Polaroid under our arms, and we drove down to the lake. And all you can see, little smokestacks, part of a cab. It's all his stuff was right in the center of the lake, all underwater. And he came up. And, this is where I learned my first thing about swearing and went, Jesus, I can't. And he was like fuming. So then nobody saw him for like months after that because he really took a beating on that. All his equipment was stuck in the lake and growing. And they gradually, little by little, rebuilt it, repaired it, so on and so forth. Started operations up again. And then they went bankrupt. Then he started. The job never got done. So what happened eventually was through him, the Lake Association found somebody who had a dredge. What they should have done to begin with. That guy came in, plunked down all these huge wooden beams. I mean, he put the dredge is like a crane, a huge derrick on it, and they just drop it and they pull the thing in and lift it up and dump it. And that guy accomplished more in 3 or 4 weeks than John did in 3 or 4 years or more. Did the whole lake. It was done, it was clean, it was beautiful. They filled it back up. But when the dredging project was finally complete, they filled the lake back up, and the water, it was unbelievable. It was crystal clear. You could, when the old dock used to be out in the center of the lake, you could stand up there and see to the bottom, or you could dive off and go all the way to the bottom. It was like being in your bathtub. It was crystal clear. It was somebody's pool. And all of a sudden around June or July, this weed started growing. I don't know what it was. Nobody knew where it came from. It infested the entire lake. You couldn't move. There were weeds sticking out of the water about 6 or 7 feet high. They were everywhere. Now they're sitting there like, well, we got this beautiful lake, but we can't go swimming because it's an invasion of these weeds. So somebody came up with the idea. They got 2 rowboats and they bought this thing. It looked just like a set of hedge trimmers, but it was square. The 2 blades going out like this, and 2 blades. They mounted them on the front of the rowboats. They paddled out there. Of course, the thing weighed a ton, so all the rowboats this much out of the water in the front and about that high out of the water in the back with these gas motors on the back. And they started going back and forth, cutting all these weeds. Well, that lasted for about a week and a half until both of the things broke, and the weeds came right back. The problem got worse and worse, and they, I guess, contacted the Department of Parks and Recreation somewhere in the state, and they had to come in and treat the lake with chemicals to kill the weed. Of course, he couldn't swim. All the fish died. Everything. This is a story that's never going to go away, and nothing, they didn't. That summer was a total loss. Next winter, they drained the lake out. They came and they cut down all the weeds, dug them all out. What a mess that was. And for some reason after that, the issue didn't come back.
When they did the dredging in '66, the environmental rules weren't quite the same. So the ball field area was created, and they cut all the trees down there, and they used the dirt from the lake, from the dredging, to fill the ball field.
And then I couldn't wait for summertime. When they first started the project, the baseball field was all woods.
Yeah.
And they cut the trees down, they set them on fire. First, I'm sitting up there with a bunch of other friends of mine. I got covered. I don't know how this happened. I didn't know it could happen. A day and a half later, my whole body was covered in poison ivy. Through the air, and it was all over me. I couldn't see for 2 days. My eyes were stuck closed, my arms, my everything. And nobody could go. My parents wouldn't believe me. They thought I went down there, and I said, no, it's standing. I could tell you, Mama, here's look, Mr. Thompson was there, he saw me, so they collaborated my story. So I was off the hook, but still, I just remember scratching, itching forever. I didn't know that because of being, the
burning,
material being...
it's the worst thing. Well, of course.
Sure was fun to watch it, though.
Very few things are super important in a development, but water systems are. And on the mountainside, there was a tower up at the top of Evergreen, and they had an above-ground pipe system, and the water would flow down those pipes to all the little houses up there, and that was the main water supply. And it was supplied by a small little building that was located between Miners and Catalpa. I think they called it the Witch House, because it was overgrown with poison ivy and it barely functioned, but it would send the water up there. And Today, there's some remains of that. You see at the very top 3 cylinder block areas, and this wooden water tower sat on top of that. As part of the water system, they also did some drilling off of Hickory. And in 1948, these guys were drilling, and at a depth of about 180 feet, hit about 115 gallons per minute of water, which is a heck of a geyser. So everyone knew the mountain was full of water, but almost everybody else had to drill about 400 feet to get water. And there were a private water company that ran the valley side, and it only had about 20 customers. Never did any maintenance. The water was brown, and eventually the state says you have to do something about it. So the guy says, okay, I quit. So everybody there had to then drill their own wells.
They built it was all above ground. You could just see the pipes. They were galvanized pipes laying across on any side road, going up and down hills, going crisscrossing. And they turned it on every spring and shut it off every fall.
And they got fed from the water tower that was on the top
That
of
was
those?
there for pressure. I didn't realize that the pump, and I really didn't realize that the pump house was down at the lake in this old dilapidated building. But it was a working pump, and I'm surprised I was able to pump up 10 feet, let alone a couple hundred feet to the top of the mountain. But that's where the water tank tower came into play. He used that, which kind of grosses me out. They use that to pump the water in there, and they use that for pressure to provide houses all around the lake.
Is that tower wood or?
Oh, it was wood. It was all rotten, green, and slimy inside. And I was like, God, this is gross. I'm thinking to myself, and I mean, it leaked like crazy. The most I'd ever heard got, at least when I remember, it was probably about maybe from the floor to the. It was not really very tall. It was from the floor to the height of this arch.
Okay,
And
so
it was
7 feet something.
Yeah, it was all wood, had the iron rings around it, and that was it. There was no insulation or anything like that. And the water, as much water went into it, it used to leak right back out everywhere. I mean, it was pouring out of there, and I was like, well, what good is this?
Is there a top on it at all?
Sort of. There is some arched 2x4s and shrink wrap. It didn't even have a real roof.
Sewers were a real issue in the town here. You were responsible for your own septic system. So that meant you had to dig it. A typical septic system for these cabins around here was about a 42-gallon garbage can that you dug into the ground, and it had a bunch of holes in it. And if you partied too hard over the weekend, Monday was really, really bad. So eventually the sewers came down, the main trunk line came down Hemlock, and you couldn't have any more development up in the mountains because basalt, it doesn't really have much in the way of perk. So it's kind of tough. So everything really relied on sewers. And every time they put a sewer line in, there were illegal hookups, people putting drain water down it. Every time there was a massive storm, all the manhole covers blew off. There was raw sewage everywhere. It took them like 20 years to finally get all that out, done and out of the way and fully functioning to kind of what we have today. But it's the thing that controlled the growth of Sunset Lake. Also in 1963, we still had dirt roads everywhere. I think even Washington Valley at the time was a little bit of pea gravel, but everything else here was kind of dirt with a little bit of small rocks mixed in with it. And the town agreed to take over those roads and pave them, so they became public roads. So now people could come in. It was no longer considered a private community. Route 78 had a major impact. So you can see where in the 1964, you can see all these lines here and what everything looked like, and then you can see where Route 78 was. So it chewed through a good chunk of the land there. 2 homes were actually moved, one on Peachtree and one here at the corner of North Shore. We had significant noise increase, but this was progress, and 78 sort of affected our lives. We'll talk about single season conversion. Most of the homes, especially on the mountainside, were all single season. This meant a great opportunity because they were inexpensive. So people that didn't have a lot of money, but were somewhat handy, could come up there, purchase a house, fix it up over time. So one of the homes was the Crosby house, and the original part of the house was this section right here. And Jeff will talk a little bit about life in that section of the house. They moved it in
Really,
1965.
there was one light in the whole house that was in the kitchen. Only, as I said, only had the cold running water. There was no water to be had during winter time. But our neighbors, luckily, we hooked up a hose to their house. And I guess my father and this gentleman must have buried the hose enough where it didn't freeze. The house at Rosemary had no interior walls. All you saw was the fake half logs on the outside and studs inside. There were no interior walls. And there was no insulation. We had electric heaters back in the day. The real big, ugly old electric heaters. You plugged them in. They were constantly blowing fuses all the time. The house only had 4 fuses in the whole place. What happened after this started happening for a while, my sister and I shared a bedroom. My parents did not have a bedroom to share, so they slept out in the living room next to the fireplace, and my dad just burned wood much as he could for their heat. Their heater and our heater couldn't be out to use. The fuses kept popping. Well-built homes in Somerville, he was able to arrange for them to make an addition, but they made it in sections and brought it up the road piece by piece. And, I went to school one morning, there was nothing there. I came home, there was, a roof, 4 walls. Like, wow. And it's like double the size of it. But that was it. It was just the windows, the exterior, and the roof. My dad and I, over a number of years, I didn't think it was ever going to end. Finished off one room at a time, insulated it, wired it. I can remember putting the drywall up. I'm like, no snow blown in between the wood like the old part of the house, but there was no interior walls, there was no insulation. The furnace ran 24/7. You didn't have to worry about thermostat. Just turn it on in October and shut it off. There was no insulation to keep all the heat in the house. And you walk by everybody else's house up and down the street, there will be snow on the roof and everything like that. Not our house. There could be a foot of snow on our house. There wouldn't be a flake on the roof because it all melted off.
There was a lot of new construction in the 1960s.
And then Mr. Bunn built the Brown House.
On weekends.
And
Okay.
One man.
One man, so he did all that work?
in the 60s, he bought a foundation, right?
Yeah, he bought the lot, and there was a poured concrete foundation on that lot, but it didn't fit his plan that he wanted. So he used part of the foundation, and then he added what he needed, and the other part he just buried it, and it's in the ground. He never took it out.
So somebody else owned the lot before and had started to build and just stopped.
Yeah, that's and we were at that time. We owned the property, I guess, when he started, because he built homes up in Bedminster.
That house just turned over a few weeks ago, and those people probably don't know that.
That little shack across the street, when they finally did tear it down, there wasn't a stick of wood to haul away. The kids dragged it all down. They used to have bonfires and roller and ice skate. You can't do that anymore. They'd have big bonfires down on the lake.
Mm-hmm.
They burned up all the wood.
Another big event was the major dredging of the lake in 91 to 93. You can see all the pictures. There have been parts of slideshows. It was very fortunate for the lake community that American Cyanamid took a lot of this dirt, so it effectively just about paid for itself. But to sit there and watch as we see the raft, the dock here was actually on a raft structure. There were a lot of earth movers. There were lines and lines of trucks like this that went back and forth every day. We had a restoration fund. A lot of things got moved around and was very successful. Okay, Mother Nature had a tremendous amount of influence. We've had a lot of storms. We had Dorian in 91, the hurricane of 73, which took out almost everything that's on the spillway, Floyd 99, Sandy, and Ida. We'll hear from Gene and Jeff Crosby.
brought down boulders
Doria.
from the top of the hill and brought them, and the house that's on the corner now, that was the Gambardella house. That was the original house on the corner, the brick house, the white. All of those boulders landed on that property. I mean, people were coming from all over to see this. I mean, I kid you not, it looked like a mountain had been moved. I mean, there were lots of them, strewn in the stream down there, but the bulk of them landed on that corner house down there. I mean, it didn't damage the house.
And this is the worst of those 3 times that the water went over the top of the road. It's come very close before. During Doria it did. I wish I had the pictures. Those I lost during Hurricane Doria, which was 70 or 71. All the poles along the road where the dam is down by the beach, they were all knocked over. I mean, they were all snapped. Wires were ripped apart. There was no power in the south side of the lake for, I would say, a good 2 or 3 weeks. And again, that happened at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. The road that comes down from Shadow Oaks, that road was completely ripped out. The bridge down at the other end, the deck stayed, but the sides were swept off of it. All those homes back there, whether it's the ones you could see from the lake or if you're coming down by Hannah's house, you could see 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 homes at the bottom of Blossom. They were all heavily damaged because that brook came up. It just makes a turn and heads towards the lake. Just went right through there and destroyed all the basements and first floors. So that, it definitely went over the road.
Well, 100 years from now, somebody will be standing here and will look out and say, oh, that's a heck of a view. But those people back then, they were just so primitive. But look what they've done with the place. I mean, we started with a dream. We had valleys, we had mountains, maybe hills. We had roads. We built a spillway, we had a lake. We went horseback riding and swimming. We went exploring, we partied, we had a great time. We went through tough times, but we came out a lot stronger. We did pretty well. We've made Sunset Lake, what it is today, and we should be, very, very proud of it. But it takes work to do that. So for the sake of our children's children, volunteer. Help out, clean up, be kind. Make this the place where your kids will come out and say, oh, I grew up in Sunset Lake and I had the absolute best childhood. This is what we'd like our community to be. We became a community and a neighborhood. So that's it. We have a few acknowledgments to Juliet Marks, Chief Cat Herger and organizer, our esteemed elders and honorary esteemed elders whose wisdom and knowledge, we couldn't do this without them. All the crew who helped, and there were a lot of them, and people were very generous with their time. People provided a lot, film and audio and photos. And I'd like to have a special call out to Linda Lawson, who created all the posters that you saw today. And to Matt Shore, who printed them all and gave a very generous financial contribution to the effort. Thank you and good night.
Mike, what do you mean I failed? I was here the whole time.
I didn't see you up here. You were up there with me.
I was sitting there falling through the tool shed.
No, but I think Eric did.
Me and Robert sitting up there and all of a sudden we're going.
Turn something out.